Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Rob Matrevsky and retired Air Force Brigadier General Tom Gould from the defense company L3 Harris about the Golden Dome Missile Shield and the upcoming Air, Space, and Cyber Conference near Washington. And then we break down the latest developments in the TikTok saga, another apparent U.S. strike on a drug boat from Venezuela, and we take you inside NATO's Joint Force Command in Norfolk. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Jam-packed show this week. We've got Rob Matrevsky and Tom Gould from L3 Harris to talk about the Golden Dome Missile Shield and next week's Airspace and Cyber Conference just outside Washington, D.C. Threat Status is a media partner at that event. We'll be there in force, and we'll discuss it in more detail with Rob and Tom from L3 Harris coming up in just a few minutes. But, Guy, before we get there, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you for another week. There are several things I'm tracking off the top. We are closely reporting on the developments in the Israel-Hamas war. Israeli ground forces are churning deeper into Gaza City in what is really their second invasion of Gaza since the October 7, 2023 Hamas terrorist attacks and mass kidnapping of Israelis. There are two things that I'm specifically tracking now. One is the international uproar over Israel's campaign. I'm expecting that to become a major aspect of next week's United Nations General Assembly in New York City, when several European nations use the event to announce that they recognize a Palestinian state. People can read our coverage of that in the Threat Status newsletter and all the diplomatic tension surrounding it, particularly with the Trump administration. The second thing, though, Ben, is the prospect of a new regional escalation around the war as we head toward the 2-year anniversary of the October 7, 2023 Hamas attacks. The prospect of a peaceful settlement between Hamas and Israel really seems dead at this point since the Israeli strike earlier this month that targeted Hamas members in Qatar, a key security partner of the United States. Again, the ins and outs of that, we talked about it last week on the podcast, but we've had a lot of items in the Threat Status newsletter the past few days about it, including on Secretary of State Marco Rubio's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where there didn't seem to be too much daylight between the two on Israel's goal of destroying Hamas, even after the animosity created by the Israeli strike on Qatar. Moving on, though, Ben, there's also the ongoing Israel-Iran tensions. Israeli forces struck Iran-backed Houthi militant targets again in Yemen in recent days. And in the Threat Status pages, we took a look this past week at the Trump administration's overall policy toward Iran with a deep dive on how President Trump has actually not appointed a special envoy to work specifically on the Iranian file or the Iranian nuclear issue. We spoke to several national security sources who raised concerns that the president's consolidation of control over foreign policy into a small group of other envoys may be effective on a lot of files, but it could keep the idea of a diplomatic solution to the Iran nuclear crisis out of reach, or undermine what many thought would be a push by President Trump to try and somehow avoid big picture military escalation with Iran. While Mr. Trump has appointed emissaries for negotiating with U.S. adversaries, Steve Witkoff being the one that's most active, critics in the wider foreign affairs community warn that the group is really just too small amid diplomatic crises and wars churning in various places around the world. Moving on to one more thing quickly, Ben, our own Bill Gertz had an interview in recent days with House Intelligence Committee Chairman Rick Crawford. He's a Republican who warned that the multiple U.S. counterintelligence agencies charged with neutralizing foreign spy operations in the U.S. lack focus and need some major systematic reform. Rep. Crawford talks about how China's aggressive intelligence gathering operations in the U.S. should be the main focus of those reforms, although efforts to better counter spying by Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba will also be targeted. The nugget here, Ben, is that the House Intelligence Committee in recent days passed this major reform package within the fiscal 2026 Intelligence Authorization Bill. The legislation is now awaiting a full House vote, and specifically, it includes the so-called SECURE Act, Strategic Enhancement of Counterintelligence and Unifying Reform Efforts. That's what it stands for. A major element of that would be the establishment of a new National Counterintelligence Center, or NCIC, within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Finally, Ben, I'm preparing with others on our team, including you, to attend and report on the big Air, Space, and Cyber Conference, known in defense circles as AFA, that takes place September 22 to 24, just outside Washington, D.C. I know we're going to get into that in just a bit with our featured interview section of the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And right off the top, Guy, you mentioned just a second ago, conflicts around the world. And I want to make sure we mention this off the top because we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The U.S. this week struck another boat carrying drugs from Venezuela, according to President Trump, killing 3, what he called, quote, narco-terrorists, unquote, transporting drugs through international waters. The president posted a video on Truth Social claiming to show the operation, and it does appear as if a small speedboat explodes in the water. We, of course, don't know for sure who was on that boat. We talked recently, Guy, about whether this is actually a bona fide new military campaign by the U.S. to blow up drug-carrying boats from Venezuela and kill the alleged narco-terrorists, or just a reframing of the kinds of interdictions that the Coast Guard has been doing for years with regard to these boats. Now, critics certainly think that what's happening now, or was beginning to happen now, is a problem. I was struck by a statement from Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, who said that these blowing up, these attacks on these boats risks dragging us into a war with Venezuela. And relatedly, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said this on Monday, the day of that incident, during a Fox News interview about Venezuela and the government led by President Nicolas Maduro, quote, "We are not going to have a cartel operating or masquerading as a government operating in our own hemisphere," unquote. So we'll see where this goes, but it's clear tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela are ratcheting up quickly over this here in our own hemisphere. And speaking of close to home, Guy, last week on the show, I had an exclusive interview with French Admiral Pierre Vandier, who leads NATO's Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia. I was at ACT and NATO's Joint Force Command for a couple of days last week and had some eye-opening conversations and got a behind-the-scenes look at what NATO's actually doing on the ground here in North America, just a few hours from Washington, every single day. And there was one comment that really struck me perhaps above any other, and it's something that, of course, is true, but I think too often we don't think about in these terms. Vice Admiral James Morley of the UK's Royal Navy, the deputy commander of NATO's Joint Force Command in Norfolk, he told me that the NATO outpost there is responsible and works extensively on defending North America, including the U.S., forwards against a potential threat from Russia. In other words, NATO isn't just about the U.S. helping European nations defend themselves against the possibility of Russian attacks. It works the other way around as well. And Admiral Morley said this, quote, "Because the threat vector viewed from North America from Russia is north. In other words, it's not a threat that comes from the east. The direct path of a missile fired from Russia to North America is over the North Pole. into North America, unquote. So we're going to talk about the Golden Dome missile shield here in a minute. And part of that, of course, hinges on having the right kinds of defenses in place in the northern U.S. and Alaska and Canada even to protect the American homeland in the event of that kind of a Russian attack using perhaps something like hypersonic missiles. But it isn't just the U.S. and Canadian militaries working on that problem. They're not the only ones working on defensive plans to, for example, protect North America if sea ice keeps melting and during an actual legitimate kinetic war, Russia tries to send nuclear armed ships or submarines through Arctic waters to fire at the U.S. or Canada from right off of our shores. So we're not the only ones working to counter Russian irregular warfare, influence campaigns, political warfare, social media operations, or even counting Russian cyber attacks. NATO is doing that too, and there are nearly 400 people from 27 of the 32 NATO countries represented at Joint Force Command in Norfolk doing that work. And I talked to a number of them from the UK, France, and Finland on the record while I was there, but I saw and chatted off the record with folks from Canada and other nations. I could go on with all the NATO members. But the bottom line here, just Guy, I wanted to point out quickly is this, and it's an important one. We can have a debate, and we have, and we'll continue to have, about whether the U.S. shoulders too much of the financial burden for the defense of Europe. I think that's probably true, and European nations have acknowledged it to an extent as they've pledged to spend at least 5% on their own defense next decade. But keep in mind that some of that money they're spending on defense, at least a small portion of it, is going to pay folks like Admiral Morley, who right now are on American soil working to protect the United States.
It also pays for the purchase, Ben, of weaponry produced by American companies.
And we are joined now by Rob Matrevsky, President, Golden Dome Strategy and Integration, and retired Air Force Brigadier General Tom Gould, Vice President, Global Business Development, both at the top defense firm L3 Harris. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure, and you're breaking new ground here because I think in about 18 months of Guy and I doing this podcast, we've never actually had two guests on at the same time. So I know our listeners will appreciate the fact that you're both here. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks for having us, Ben and Guy.
Thanks, Ben.
Okay, we're going to get deep in the weeds here on the Golden Dome missile shield in just a minute. But before we do, next week is the Air and Space Forces Association's Air, Space, and Cyber Conference just outside Washington at National Harbor. Tom, let me throw this question at you to start. What is L3 Harris doing at the conference? What will you have on display? And at this, pivotal moment in geopolitics and national security, what's the message that you hope people take away from the Airspace and Cyber Conference?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. Great question. And we're excited to be joining the Department of the Air Force for the Air Force Association conference next week. Really, our goal during the conference is to showcase the multi-domain solutions we bring in sensing, connectivity, and effects in the effort to enable air and space superiority for the Air Force. The theme for this year's show is Air and Space Superiority, a decisive advantage. And we certainly want to showcase those capabilities that support that. But in addition to those capabilities, we're going to have a pretty prominent audio-visual presentation of the capabilities we bring in support of Golden Dome. Okay, so we're going to show you specifics on the sensing side of the house, on the connectivity side of the house, and on the effects side of the house. And together, we're going to demonstrate how strong a support we give the department.
Rob, as I said, we're going to talk about some Golden Dome specifics in just a minute, but let's start with this. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is your job, President of Golden Dome Strategy and Integration, was just created back in July, a couple of months ago, a new role, a new job inside L3 Harris. Can you explain to us and to our listeners why this project, the proposed Golden Dome missile shield, warranted the creation of this new high-level position inside the company?
Thanks, Ben. So look, we as a company feel like our capabilities align very well with the Golden Dome executive order. And the executive order really calls out a number of things that are wide-ranging, right? It's a regional, homeland, national, global sort of reach in terms of the Golden Dome executive order. The threat is there. It's right on our doorstep. We've seen actual conflict in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East. We've seen China and the Chinese threat as they seek to become the preeminent economic and military and space power over the next few years, demonstrate their capabilities. The president's written an executive order that is thorough, wide-ranging, and very important to our nation. Our company thought that this was one of the most important initiatives that's coming out of this administration. They thought it important enough to bring together the capabilities of L3Harris. They're broad-reaching, and we want to be aligned with the president's vision, with General Guetlein's vision for the architecture. And we thought this role and our ability to drive that alignment within our company in the way we present ourselves to the nation and to the Department of War was very important, and therefore it was created.
Okay. Let's drill into that a little bit more. And I know Guy will get into some more details about contracts and the technology involved. But I know, for example, L3 completed a $100 million expansion at a satellite integration and test facility in Florida to, as you put it in a press release, support the urgent need for on-orbit technology related to Golden Dome. What else are you doing to prepare? Can you give us any more specifics or details about facilities you're either building or expanding, or the amount of money you're spending, people you're hiring, how much work on a daily basis in your offices is going into preparing for Golden Dome? To the extent that you can, and I know some of this is sensitive and protected classified information, but to the extent that you can, for our audience, to take us kind of behind the curtain a little bit of what it's like for a defense firm like, the size and scope and influence of L3Harris to prepare for this kind of a project.
Yeah, so we saw this day coming, I would say, several years ago, Ben. I think if you look at our investments that started nearly 5 years ago in technology that's relevant for this mission set. If you look at our capital expenditures across the different portfolios of our company, we knew the demand signal would happen just about now. So our readiness was very important to us. The preparedness of our manufacturing capability, of our technology relevance was very important. We've spent actually over $750 million of our own investment in facilities and capitalization across our Aerojet Rocketdyne business, across our space business, across different states like Indiana and Florida, Alabama. And we believe that it was really vitally important for us to demonstrate a supply chain resiliency, a capability within our own walls, not only in terms of that technology and that research and development that we invested in and those actual products and demonstrated relevant capability, but also in terms of our manufacturing capability and the resilient supply chain behind it.
And Ben, if I could add, it's really about giving our customer the ability to scale, right? Because the threat is, the numbers you start to see from the threat are pretty high. And so scaling to the threat will be important going forward. And L3Harris is invested in those, whether in production from our solid rocket motors, which we produce 100,000 a year, through our sensor and integration capabilities in Fort Wayne in Florida.
Rob and Tom, it's Guy Taylor. I have what could be a really basic question maybe about architecture. In the architecture of Golden Dome, what percentage of Golden Dome do you see as being space-based?
Well, it's a great question. And what we continue to say is we're respectfully waiting for General Guetlein's architecture report to become public. We understand that this week it was completed and starting to become briefed up the chain in DepSec War, Secretary of War, and perhaps other staff. We also understand that we don't want to be too presumptuous about the architecture based on General Guetlein's public remarks. Now, that said, you look at the executive order and you do see a significant amount of space implementation plans called out, the hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensor, acceleration, which is one that we're focused on because we have been demonstrating the Missile Defense Agency's key success criteria on orbit on that, and we think that's one of the quick wins for the administration that'll be part of this architecture. We see a reference to the proliferated warfighter space architecture. We have custody layer, transport layer content sort of all over that PWSA, as well as our 3 tranches as a prime on the tracking layer. We see left of launch capabilities, which are clearly ours and can happen from all domains, ground, air, and space. And we see other capabilities that are driving towards space-based solutions. As I said at the beginning, the Chinese threat is driving towards a significant capability in space for them. They have over 1,000 active satellites in space right now. So I do expect there to be a significant portion of it, but we'll continue to wait for making sure that we understand clearly what the administration wants through General Gutlein and the architecture report that's coming out very soon.
Interesting. This may be a very long yes or no question. Speaking of President Trump's executive order, the order did explicitly mention or set a goal of expanding the HBTSS layer. L3Harris has been a leader in developing HBTSS for tracking hypersonics from space. The Missile Defense Agency had awarded Northrop Grumman $155 million back in 2021. At that time, L3Harris also got a contract for about $121 million to develop HBTSS prototypes. L3 has been successful in that development. The company has put out updates about this. This is all in the public sphere. But as of yet, when we're talking about the actual contracts for Golden Dome, has L3 or any other company actually been awarded a contract yet?
No, we're not awarded anything to accelerate HBTSS yet. We have transitioned some of that technology into the Space Development Agency's tracking layer. So we're proud that we've been able to do that as well. But Golden Dome related, again, I think it's based on what the architecture report will say. We're really happy to see in the executive order that line item. It's the only line item that says accelerate a capability rather than develop and deploy it. It infers a state of readiness, which we clearly believe in, and we've clearly demonstrated the Missile Defense Agency's key success objectives within our on-orbit demonstration. We have maintained our active supply chain. We've assured capacity not only in our walls but within our supply chain. They're ready to go. We're ready to go. So when we get the word, if we get the word from the architecture report, then we stand at the ready to deliver and deliver within the president's timeline.
There is a lot of speculation, obviously among the handful of journalists paying attention to this and writing about it. But also, I mean, I saw this at Space and Missile Defense down in Huntsville, I believe last month. There's a lot of speculation within the industry about what companies will really be at the center of this Golden Dome development, who's going to be driving it. Some speculate that there's some sort of behind-the-scenes agreement between Lockheed Martin and RTX. Those two companies are often listed as the 2 biggest defense contractors in the world. L3Harris, by the way, is almost always listed up there in the top 10 as well. Some say that somehow Lockheed and RTX are controlling things behind the scenes or influencing them. Do you have any insights or thoughts on that? And then philosophically and more broadly, we've got this kind of question about competition versus collaboration. You know, there's speculation that new disruptor companies like Palantir and Anduril and SpaceX will be given maybe preferential treatment because of their proximity to the White House, the Trump White House. Any thoughts on this that you have? Is this going to be a range of companies? Do they have to work together? How does that play out in your mind?
I think it is a complex problem to solve, right? If you look at the executive order and you think about what it calls for, you would think that there is a wide-ranging set of capabilities that will be required here. There's not one company or two companies that can really satisfy all the needs of the Golden Dome executive order. So I think it'll take some sort of team that's made up of national capabilities, traditional, innovative, et cetera. Our company sits with one foot sort of in each camp where we say we're big enough to be trusted and small enough to be agile and innovative. We've demonstrated that through the successes we've had in real capability. But look, I think it'll be a combination of the competition you expect to see across the industry with a collaboration that's necessary from the nation that seeks to protect itself. And I think that's what General Gutlein is doing well. He's setting the expectations that we'll have to collaborate and bring the best of our capabilities there. We think we can obviously play in lots of areas, but it's up to General Gutlein and his staff to decide who plays where and where the gaps are, where existing technology can be leveraged, and how to integrate that together.
Rob, I want to follow up on something you just mentioned, that was being able to deliver on the timeline that President Trump has set, which is, I think, by most accounts, a pretty ambitious timeline of 3 years to get this up and running. Do you have any thoughts on what sort of the definition of meeting that timeline looks like? I mean, are we talking about essentially having 100% the entire Golden Dome architecture in place, ready to roll at that 3-year mark? Or is this going to be sort of phased in over time, where maybe at that 3-year mark, we don't have a final product of Golden Dome, essentially?
Well, I think, again, I think we're presupposing what Golden Dome is, first of all, right? And we want to make sure that we see what the administration's view of it is through their architecture report. But look, I think it depends on the capability. Some, as I call them, shovel-ready capabilities like HBTSS, we can clearly meet the president's timelines. There may be other areas which are more ambitious, which will be phased in. I think you've seen sort of spiral development, spiral approaches by the Space Force that seek to continue to implement expanding capabilities and evolving capabilities like we do with the Space Development Agency, that are a good model for some of the harder work that our nation needs to do. So I think there's a combination of it. I think the other thing is that, as opposed to the 80s when we were inventing technology and it was a very ambitious plan, here we're integrating technology, and the technology building blocks that are necessary are mostly there. And the challenge is really in the integration of the architecture and the definition of the architecture and the objectives that you want to accomplish when. I think the timeline is vitally important, right? So we do need to make sure that some basis of this architecture is leveraging existing demonstrated capability, which is why we have talked about HBTSS, a bit here and previously.
And Ben, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that it will be a combination of existing capabilities that we iterate on and next gen capabilities that are developed to address the threat, which is quickly evolving going forward, right? And so that's the real challenge going forward. Until that architecture comes out, we're not going to know what's legacy or improvements to legacy and what's next gen. But I think we're well positioned to support both lines of effort. Whatever way the customer wants to go, L3Harris is positioned well.
And I think that collaboration that you brought up earlier, right, versus competition, will play a part in terms in the partnerships that may be necessary, right? We're partnered with some other companies like Palantir, for example, on artificial intelligence, lots of other companies in terms of our sort of more mission-based, on-orbit-based capabilities with hardware. And I think those collaborative approaches and those partnerships are going to be necessary here to solve this problem.
Okay, let's close out with this in the couple of minutes we have left. We're, of course, having a conversation here about Golden Dome, so I want to ask about the broader conversation around Golden Dome and what has, at least from our vantage point, the vantage point of the media, to some folks seemed like a gag order issued by the Pentagon, by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, to military officials and DOD to not talk publicly about the Golden Dome. There have been industry meetings about it, of course, and obviously the Defense Secretary and General Gutlein, as you mentioned, have talked about it. But Guy and I can both personally attest that we've essentially gotten a no comment from key military figures when we want to talk about Golden Dome, including folks who will presumably, because of their current jobs, have a direct role in some form or another with the project. Why do you think the administration is doing it this way? Do you think it's a problem that military officials aren't talking more about this publicly? Or is this idea of a gag order, is that essentially being blown out of proportion and it's essentially par for the course that when you have a major sensitive military, national security initiative like this, that you're not going to have a bunch of people out there talking publicly about it? Just curious if either of you have thoughts on the broader conversation or lack thereof that we've been having about Golden Dome.
Thanks, Ben. I think some of it is natural, right? As you said, it's a sensitive capability to protect our nation. You didn't expect us to all be talking about how we're doing that and exposing exactly what the architecture looks like and what our view of it. But secondly, I go back to the theme, which is a lot of speculation. We want to be respectful to the administration in releasing their architectures, that we know exactly what it is rather than speculate about it as an industry out loud. It's natural to want to speculate, but it leads us down sort of inaccurate paths if we don't have a really good amount of clarity about it. And so the architecture report, vitally important to us as a nation and as an industry. The 120-day report on acquisition strategy is the follow-up of that. And I think the clarity will come, and then we'll talk about it in the right way, both publicly and privately, about what it is we need to do as an industry, as a nation, as a government.
Rob Petrevsky, Tom Gould from L3 Harris. Thanks so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Guy.
Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. And Guy, my threat of the week is emotional connections being formed between young people, teenagers, and AI companions or chatbots. We've talked about this before on the show, and it's one of the most fascinating and potentially frightening aspects of the artificial intelligence explosion that we're seeing right now. The fact that Americans, especially younger people, really do seem to be having hours-long conversations and in some cases developing relationships with AI. The Federal Trade Commission this week opened a formal investigation into this issue, and the commission voted unanimously to force 7 leading social media companies, OpenAI, Character AI, X.AI, Snap, Instagram, Alphabet, and Meta, to disclose how they profit from the companions and what steps they've taken to protect minors. The companies have pledged to cooperate in this investigation, and kudos to our colleague Sean Salai here at the Washington Times for writing about this and doing the due diligence of contacting them for their response. But here's why this is a problem in a nutshell. The Boston-based parental monitoring app Aura found that 36% of 10,000 users they surveyed, ages 13 to 17, said they devoted their interactions with AI companions just over the past 6 months to sexual or romantic role-playing. 23% of the teens said they relied on the programs for creative make-believe, essentially creating fantasy worlds with their AI friends. 11% said they rely on the apps for emotional support, 10% for friendship, and we can go on. But basically what it means is that for some young Americans, AI apps and chatbots are really, truly starting to replace human relationships and the kinds of experiences we've all had as teenagers and young adults, parts of growing up. being replaced by technology, by our phones. So not much more needs to be said about that guy. It's obvious why right now this is a threat of the week.
Yes, Ben, that's pretty interesting. I'm trying to digest exactly what you just went through. It's heavy stuff. My threat of the week is that the U.S. government is dragging its feet on implementing the law that was passed last year with bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats to either force a sale of the social media platform TikTok from its current China-based owners or shut it down in the United States. This is obviously a tricky situation, and we've discussed it at length in previous podcast episodes, Ben. But what we saw in this past couple of days was that the Trump administration signaled it has reached some sort of a deal with the Chinese government on the future of TikTok. The catch is that the administration has provided really very few specific details on that deal. What we're hearing is that ByteDance, the Chinese company that currently owns TikTok, and is accused of being an inculocutor between the platform's unsuspecting users, millions of young people in the United States, and the Chinese government intelligence agencies. What we're hearing is that ByteDance will somehow be allowed to spin off a new company based in the U.S. to own TikTok going forward. We're tracking this in threat status, Ben, and my threat of the week is that there's a real possibility that Chinese intelligence does use TikTok to sow messages and narratives among young Americans that democracy is disastrous and divisive and inadequate, and that the U.S. government is dragging its feet on doing anything dramatic about this, most likely because the very elected officials who could do something about it, President Trump among them, believe that their own popularity is itself enhanced by TikTok. In other words, they use the platform and think they're benefiting from it politically.
Telling of the times we're in that both of our threats of the week this week deal with young people and their phones, essentially social media and AI. That's just the reality of the world that we're increasingly living in every single day. Thank you so much for that. And a big thanks, of course, to Rob Matrevsky and Tom Gould from L3Harris for that great conversation earlier. And a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.